Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back. Today we're just gonna hop right into it. I'm gonna be giving you guys 5 tips to instantly up your sourdough game. The first thing I think you can do to up your sourdough game right away would be strength. Beginner bread bakers just don't put enough strength in their doughs. A good strong dough with a well-developed gluten network gives us a higher rise in the oven, a loaf that's easier to shape, and something that has a more open crumb. So to address this issue of weak dough, there's 3 moves that I would recommend. The first move would be to use bread flour as a crutch. Bread flour is a good way for a beginner to get a stronger dough early on. It's no longer my go-to flour for bread, but early on I definitely use the higher gluten content to make my dough stronger. The second strength building move I would recommend is to give your bread a more thorough mix. Whether you're doing it by hand or in a mixer, giving it more physical development, more strength in the beginning will always give you a better result. And I wouldn't worry about over mixing. It's really hard to do that at home. These days, most of the time I use a stand mixer, and for my final mix, I give it 4 minutes on low speed and then 4 minutes on high speed. This usually gives me all the strength that I need to get a well-risen, easy to shape loaf. The third and last move that I would recommend to build a stronger dough would be to give it more folds during bulk ferment. And as a reminder, the bulk ferment is that first rise. It's what happens right after we mix the dough. Normally a recipe might recommend just 1 or 2 folds at the 30 and 60 minute mark. I say if you have a slack dough, fold it every 30 minutes throughout the entire process over the 3 or 4 hours that you're fermenting it. Don't be afraid. It's actually really hard to over strengthen your dough at home, like I said before. If you combine all 3 of these moves, I guarantee it, you're gonna have better bread. My second tip today is gonna be use more hydration. And for you guys that are new to the bread baking game, when I talk about hydration, I'm just referring to the ratio of flour to water in the formula. Having a wetter dough gives us a better chance at an open crumb, but it also gives us a more custardy, satiny interior. It kind of changes the way the starch in the flour gelatinizes. I'm not gonna lie, the wetter doughs are a little bit more challenging for the beginner. They're harder to shape, they're hard to move around, they're kind of sticky, and you definitely have to know what you're doing to get them strong enough. Even if you go to flip out this dough and it's a little bit slack because you didn't get enough strength into it, you're still gonna be left with an incredibly tender, super satiny crumb that has a lot of flavor that you just wouldn't have gotten with a drier dough. For a country style sourdough where we're using like 10% whole grain flour, I usually recommend 75 to 80% hydration, but whole grain baking is definitely where high hydration really starts to pay off. And if you're doing 100% whole wheat, fresh milled type bread, a high hydration is really the only way to get open crumb and something that's tender and custardy on the inside. If you're going drier with that type of bread, it's gonna taste like something that you would find in the back of like a hippie grocery store. It's gonna be dry and kind of tough and no luxury there. It's just, so tip number 3 is gonna be to embrace autolyse. For you guys who are beginners out there, I'll recap. Autolyse is the first step in any real sourdough process. We're hydrating some of the water and some of the flour, sometimes all of it, ahead of time. Without salt, without sourdough starter, we're just letting the flour and water come together over an extended period of time to slowly hydrate it. If you see a sourdough recipe out there that skips autolyse, don't waste your time. Like I said, the reason we do the autolyse is to fully hydrate the flour, but it's also to increase the extensibility of our dough. Okay, so what's extensibility and why do I care about that, bro? Extensibility is the dough's ability to be stretched without retraction. This is a good thing for building a stronger dough, but it also gives us a dough that's easier to shape, and it's most likely gonna have a more open crumb. I recommend, if you can, at least 30 minutes of autolyse, but preferably 2 hours. And there's a big difference in quality between 30 minutes and 2 hours. In my experience, I love a good, long, slow autolyse. Yes, that's what I said. And if you're the type of person that's dabbling in high percentage whole grain breads, you definitely should do an autolyse. Those whole grain flours need to be hydrated slowly for a while, and if you don't do this, you're definitely leaving a lot of quality on the table. And just to finish this one off, high whole grain breads are also a lot more predictable to ferment when you do an autolyse. Whole grain breads can get a little crazy. They can get out of hand, they can go too fast. So autolyse is your friend. Tip number 4 is gonna be temperature matters a lot. And it basically boils down to 2 things: managing the temperature of your final dough and managing the temperature of the space that that dough is fermenting in. A cold dough just isn't gonna do anything we need it to. A final dough temperature that's just 4 degrees off could mean 4 hours in terms of final fermentation time and the maturity of the dough. So get a decent digital instant read thermometer and shoot to keep your dough temperature between 78 and 80 degrees whenever possible. This is gonna ensure that things are active and you're not gonna be waiting 6 agonizing hours for this dough to develop on your counter. So to get your dough to that that final dough temp, when we pull it out of the bowl and start our bulk fermentation, you're probably gonna have to start with about 95-degree water. Because remember, we're gonna be doing an autolyse, so this dough is gonna be sitting there for a little bit of time and it's gonna cool off. So starting with warm water is gonna compensate for that, but it'll also compensate for any heat loss from measuring it into a cold bowl, or maybe your flour is sitting at room temperature and that's colder. 95 degrees in my experience pretty much nails us at 78 degrees most of the year. The other part of this, like I mentioned before, is the ambient temperature of the space that you're fermenting the dough in. So in the summertime, in the wintertime, I try and keep my house at a relatively even temperature, 76 degrees if I can. And this temperature thing will also apply to the temperature of the water you feed to your sourdough starter. I usually go with room temperature, or what I would call 78, 76 degrees, just to make sure things are ripening at a predictable rate. So when I come back around at 8 a.m., things look good and I'm ready to bake. So our last tip, tip number 5, would be eliminate variables. Everyone's house is its own little bakery with its own little strict rules specific to that environment. When we crack down on all the details, from our scale, the container we ferment the dough in, our thermometer, we're a lot more likely to have success. When we eliminate variables and we bake bread often, we can actually start to isolate what's changing and what we did to impact that change. And this is really important because as we learn those things, we can manage them for better results. One of the biggest things I recommend as you're getting started is just use the same container. I like this Samla container from IKEA, but if you have like a big Cambro, like this is an 8-quart, I think, those work too. And after a while of eliminating variables, you'll start to see what levers you can pull to improve your bread. And that'll make bread baking a lot more enjoyable for you. It basically becomes this really fun, iterative process where every time you start it, you're excited to see what the outcome is, instead of starting and being a little bit worried, like, is this bread gonna rise? Is it gonna be a pancake? Will I be wasting my weekend again? Am I gonna be double bummed that this didn't work out? So eliminate variables, you're not gonna be sorry. And that's it. Those are 5 quick tips that I wish I would have known when I started bread baking. These ideas weren't laid out clearly on the internet 7 or 8 years ago, and I think this is gonna nudge you from beginner to intermediate at the very least. So if you have any questions on this stuff, please leave them down below in the comments. I love helping you guys out with bread baking. It really helps me kind of clarify how I talk about this process. So please use the comments or hit us up on Instagram. And if you end up baking some bread, tag us. I love seeing that stuff. So that's it. This was a quick one. Thank you guys so much for your time and attention today. Thank you for sticking around, and we'll see you next time.